All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Let us begin. We are continuing in Mesillas Yesharim. Actually, today we're going to finish up Parak Yudal, the 14th chapter of Mesillas Yesharim. So we are, remember again, we started talking about the concept of precious. And we saw that in precious, thank you so much. So we saw that in the concept of precious, ultimately, again, there were three different levels. There was what the Ramchal called precious banos, which means separating oneself from what the Ramchal called excess pleasure. Again, as we pointed out, however you're defining excess, right? Good. Then there's precious bedinim, which we saw in yesterday's shiur, which was a focus ultimately again on chumras in halacha. And ultimately again understanding that in certain areas of Jewish law, I should really be going above and beyond. And now we come to the third category, and this is very interesting. Va'prishus b'minhagim. So I'll say, what does this mean? And even the term itself is quite intriguing. What does it mean to be porish, to have a sense of prishus b'minhagim? He says, Hispodedos v'hibadal minachevra hamedinis. This is actually incredible. This refers ultimately again to separating oneself from social interactions. So what's interesting is as follows. Human beings we're social beings, so often we gravitate towards social interactions, which of course is a beautiful thing. But there's also a concept of being alone with oneself, a sense of hisbodedus, a sense of being alone. The final slibo el ha'avoda, vizbonus bakarai. Why? Because when a person is alone with himself, what he's able to do is he's able to focus on what his mission is in life. What am I supposed to work on? Who am I supposed to be? What am I supposed to become? So the idea over here, so this is precious b'minhagim. So minhagim, what he's referring minhagim over here, not as custom as we normally go ahead and use it, but rather ultimately again like a separating oneself from normative social behaviors. My normal social behavior is that I interact with people. So precious is, there's a time, of course, to interact with people, but there's also a time to be alone with oneself. There's a time to go ahead and separate from others and just be with me. He says, Ubitnai, shaloyita gambaze ala katzal acher. Now, of course, we have to be very careful because obviously one has to be careful not to be antisocial, right? And not to totally and fully remove one's self from social interactions, to go to the opposite extreme. Shekvar Amru Zichron Lebrachas Chazal said, "The olam tehidaito shel adam mu'ureves imabrios." A person, of course, has to know how to get along with other people. Literally, again, mu'ureves has to go ahead and be kind, or ultimately, again, be social with other individuals. So I'll say, so this interesting balance, like we see in so many different areas in life, that on one hand, again, a person has to go ahead and be social. A person has to know how to maintain proper social interactions, while at the same time, a person has to know that there's a time not to be social, and a time to be alone with oneself. Amru, Charev al abad min ha'alu, Charev al soneim shatamidich chacham shiyoshvin bad bebad, Va'oskin b'Torah. We'll say a very interesting Gemara Mesillas Brachos. So the Gemara says that there's something very detrimental to always learning by oneself. What's the challenge of learning by oneself? That if you make a mistake, there's no one there to correct you. And if you're learning by yourself, you can make the mistake. Not only make the mistake, but what? Reinforce the mistake over and over. So you see this interesting balance. That on one hand, precious b'minhagim means you have to separate yourself from social interactions, be alone with yourself, carve out time for yourself. But lest you think that means be an antisocial person away from other people. No, that's actually very unhealthy. To not have friends, to not have peers, to not have proper normative social interactions, that's not what Chazal wanted. In a learning sense of Osai, the danger is you make mistakes and you reinforce those mistakes, and just in a human sense, human beings require good, healthy social interactions. And if you don't have that, one is stunted in their own growth. Ella yischabra adam imatovim zman mashim itzarich lo lilimudo o leparnasaso. Rather, Rabbi say it's important for a person to cultivate normative social interactions, and therefore again connect with other people, good people, for the necessary amount of time. Of course, necessary is relative. Necessary for your learning, necessary for your parnasa, The Ramchal doesn't say it, but I think still it's also understood, also necessary for your own healthy social development. While at the same time, having all of your healthy social interactions for your learning, for your parnasa, for your social development, but yet at the same time carving out time for yourself. Carving out time for yourself, ultimately again to be alone with yourself, to be alone with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that way you can speak about the direction and trajectory ultimately of your life. We'll say part of this social precious, we'll call it, is the avoidance of what we'll call unnecessary speech, idle speech. I will say, to be clear, idle speech doesn't have to mean anything illegal. It doesn't have to mean lashon hara. Idle speech is just as it sounds, unnecessary chatter. So sometimes, again, when there's constant social interaction, that leads to unnecessary social chatter. But a person exercises a certain level of, we'll call it social restraint, or a certain level of social precious. Not only does that allow them to focus on their own spirituality, spiritual development and growth, but it also helps one to avoid that idle chatter. Also prevents a person from looking outside of their own davar amis. So I'll say this is also very interesting. The idea over here is that just being alone with oneself, again, what he calls this social precious, this idea of having healthy social interactions while at the same time also recognizing that there is something to be said for being away from people, for being alone with myself, helps me again to, number one, focus on my spiritual mandates, development and growth. Number two, it also goes ahead and helps me avoid idle chatter. Number three, it also helps me to focus on what I'm supposed to focus. It's lashon over here that he says, don't look out of your arba amos. So I'll say, what does that mean? Not to look out of your arba amos. We spend so much time sometimes focusing on other people, right? Whether it's what other people are doing, what other people aren't doing. And the truth is, in life, of course, from a chesed perspective, it's good to focus on other people. But from a life perspective, don't worry about what anyone else is doing. Worry about you. Worry about you. The best way to worry about you is to carve out time to think about you and to carve out time in which you are away from other people. An incredible, incredible idea. We'll say last paragraph. So therefore, now we've rounded it out. So 3 elements of precious. 3 elements of precious. So once again, precious ba'ana. So again, precious from pleasure, right? Precious from excess pleasures. Precious ultimately bedinim, finding chumras in halacha, in necessary chumras. And now precious b'minhagim, social precious as well. Therefore says Ramchal, these 3 elements of precious, even though again, we've really only spoken of them in very succinct terms. You see how I say that even though we've only addressed them in a very succinct way, we've seen ultimately again how they include so many different aspects of life. And I will say ultimately again, as we've established, I've already said to you that Ramchal says that in many of these things, I can't give you every detail. Right? I will say this in general, Ramchal says almost in every section, right? There are so many details to give. So Ramchal says, I can't give you every detail. I will say, by the way, that's part of the beauty of this. It wouldn't be good if he gave us every detail. Why? Because if he gave us every single detail, then what? I wouldn't have to think about anything. The goal over here is that Ramchal gives me the general overview, right? He gives me the framework. Then it becomes my job to go ahead and try to plug in the framework. First of all, to expand upon the framework, and then ultimately again to plug in the framework to my life. Shapratim iyef shalimaser kiyem l'shikol hadas liyashir osam al yosher haklal va'amito. Ramchal says ultimately again, my goal is to give you a general framework, to give you an overview, to get you to start thinking and ultimately understand how to apply these principles to your life. So we'll say Mazel Tov on finishing the 14th paragraph. Baruch Hashem, we're making our way. 14th paragraph of Mesillas Yesharim. So we'll say, so again, we're not finished with Prishus. Remember again, in this next section is going to be B'darchei Keniyos HaPrishus. So Sunday we'll start the Meretz Hashem with how one actually acquires the midah of Prishus. We'll stop over here for today. Shkoyach, everyone.